When Huey Long was assassinated in 1935, he left behind more than a shattered political movement. He left behind 3 children, each forced to grow up in the long shadow of one of the most powerful and controversial politicians in American history. Some inherited the legacy, some rejected it, some quietly stepped away from power altogether. This video is not about Huey Long's rise or fall. It's about what happened next. What became of his daughter, who disappeared from public life? How did his son transform a populist dynasty into one of the most powerful careers in U.S. Senate history? And why did his youngest child choose a path far from politics altogether? This is the complete story of Huey Long's children, their lives, their families, and how they each carried, reshaped, or escaped the Long name. Rose Lolita Long was born in 1917 in Shreveport, Louisiana, the first child of Huey Pierce Long and Rose McConnell Long. Her family called her Dolly from the beginning. At the time of her birth, Huey Long was not yet the political force he would become. He was a young attorney working on railroad cases, building a reputation, but not yet wielding power. The Long household was middle class, unremarkable by the standards of Louisiana society. There were no security details, no reporters outside the door, no constant stream of political supplicants. Dolly entered a world that was about to change dramatically. For the first years of her life, Dolly experienced something her younger siblings never would, a version of normalcy. Her father was building his career, but he still came home at predictable hours. The family lived modestly. Political ambition was present, but it had not yet consumed everything. This period would not last long. By the time Dolly was beginning school, Huey Long was positioning himself for the governorship. The household was beginning its transformation from private family to public institution. By her early adolescence, Dolly's home life bore little resemblance to ordinary childhood. The Long residence became a command center, political advisors arrived at all hours, security became necessary. Every movement, every conversation, every appearance had potential political implications. Dolly grew up watching her father orchestrate one of the most aggressive political operations Louisiana had ever seen. The Share Our Wealth movement was expanding nationally. The house filled with strategists, journalists, and supplicants. Privacy became a luxury the family could no longer afford. For a teenage girl, this meant living under scrutiny that few children of her era experienced. Every social interaction, every friendship, every decision was filtered through the lens of her father's political position. When Huey Long entered the U.S. Senate in 1932, Dolly was 15 years old. The family's status shifted from regional to national. Her father was now one of the most recognizable political figures in America, celebrated by millions, despised by millions more. Dolly's adolescence coincided with the height of her father's influence. She watched him challenge President Roosevelt, build a national following, and position himself as a potential presidential candidate. She also watched him make enemies at every level of government. The intensity of this period, the constant attention, the security concerns, the political warfare, shaped her understanding of what public life actually meant. On September 8, 1935, Huey Long was shot in the Louisiana State Capitol building. He died 2 days later on September 10th. Dolly was 18 years old. The assassination transformed everything instantly. The political machine that had defined her childhood collapsed into chaos. The security, the structure, the certainty, all of it evaporated. Her father was gone, and with him went the entire architecture of the family's public life. The loss was both personal and structural. Dolly had lost her father, but she had also lost the entire framework that had organized her existence since early childhood. In the immediate aftermath of Huey Long's death, Louisiana Governor O.K. Allen appointed Rose McConnell Long, Dolly's mother, to fill her husband's Senate seat. It was understood as both tribute and political necessity, a way to maintain continuity while the Long organization regrouped. Rose Long served in the Senate for just over a year, from January 1936 to January 1937. She did not seek re-election. Her time in office was brief, ceremonial, and aimed at preserving her husband's legacy rather than building her own. For Dolly, this meant her mother was now the public figure, though in a diminished capacity. The household remained political, But the energy had changed. What had been aggressive expansion was now consolidation and retreat. Documentation of Dolly's education and early adult years is notably sparse. Unlike her brothers, who would eventually enter public life, Dolly was shielded from public attention. There are no extensive records of her academic career, no profiles in newspapers, no political appearances. This absence from the historical record appears intentional. The family, having experienced the costs of extreme public exposure, seems to have made a deliberate effort to keep Dolly out of the spotlight. She was allowed privacy in a way her father never was. In 1938, at age 21, Dolly married Dr. Osman McFarland, a physician. The marriage represented a clear departure from the political world that had defined her childhood. Dr. McFarland was not a political figure. He was a medical professional, someone whose career existed entirely outside the realm of Louisiana politics. The marriage allowed Dolly to create distance from the Long legacy while remaining within respectable social circles. The wedding did not generate significant press coverage. By 1938, the Long political machine was no longer the dominant force it had been 3 years earlier. Dolly was able to marry quietly, without becoming a spectacle. After her marriage, Dolly moved to Colorado with her husband. This geographic distance from Louisiana was significant. She was not merely stepping back from politics, she was physically removing herself from the state where the Long name still carried enormous weight. In Colorado, Dolly lived as a private citizen. She did not campaign for candidates. She did not give interviews about her father. She did not leverage the Long name for social or economic advantage. Historical records from her adult years are minimal. She appears in genealogical records and occasional mentions as Huey Long's daughter, but not in the political or social chronicles of her era. This obscurity was, by all evidence, precisely what she wanted. Dolly Long McFarland lived until 2006, dying at the age of 89. She outlived both of her brothers and witnessed the complete arc of the Long political legacy, its rise, its transformation, and its eventual dissolution. When she died, obituaries noted her as the daughter of Huey Long and the sister of Russell Long, but there was little else to say. Her life had been deliberately, successfully private. In this, Dolly represents one of the three possible responses to the Long legacy: complete withdrawal. She did not fight it, did not transform it, did not leverage it. She simply stepped away, building a life defined by its distance from power rather than its proximity to it. Her legacy is the legacy of refusal, a choice that required its own form of courage. Russell Bilyeu Long was born on November 3, 1918 in Shreveport, Louisiana. His middle name honored a close friend of his father's. Unlike his older sister, Russell was born into a household already beginning its transformation into a political operation. By 1918, Huey Long was positioning himself for his first run at statewide office. The family was no longer simply middle class and private. Politics was becoming the organizing principle of their existence. Russell would never know a version of his father that was not political. From his earliest memories, power was the family business. Russell's childhood was spent at the epicenter of Louisiana politics. While other children learned about government in school, Russell watched it being executed in his living room. He sat at dinner tables where legislation was drafted, campaigns were planned, and political adversaries were strategized against. Huey Long involved his children in the political process in ways that were unusual for the era. Russell attended rallies, heard speeches, and observed the mechanics of political persuasion from an intimate distance. He learned how coalitions were built, how opposition was neutralized, how public opinion was shaped. This was not abstract education. This was apprenticeship, though it was never formally acknowledged as such. When Huey Long was assassinated in September 1935, Russell was 16 years old. He was old enough to understand exactly what had happened and what it meant. The loss was catastrophic. Russell had not merely lost his father, he had lost his mentor, his introduction to power, his model for how political life was conducted. The future that had seemed inevitable, the path that had been implicitly laid out for him, suddenly became uncertain. The assassination also created a vacuum. The Long political organization did not disappear, but it fragmented. Russell was too young to step into his father's role, and there was no clear successor. The family's political position, so secure just days before, was now vulnerable. When Rose Long accepted the Senate appointment in January 1936, Russell gained a new perspective on political continuity. His mother was not a political operator in the way his father had been. She was a placeholder, a symbol of continuity rather than a wielder of independent power. But her presence in the Senate kept the Long name active in national politics. It bought time. It signaled that the family had not been broken by the assassination. For Russell, this period was formative. He watched how political legacy could be maintained even without the charismatic force that had created it. He learned that institutional power could, under certain circumstances, survive the loss of individual genius. Russell attended Louisiana State University, an institution his father had dramatically expanded during his governorship. The campus itself was a monument to Huey Long's vision: new buildings, expanded programs, a transformation of what had been a small regional college into a genuine research university. At LSU, Russell studied law, following his father's professional path, but he was not simply imitating. He was building the credentials necessary for political life on his own terms. He understood that he could not be another Huey Long. The era that had made his father's style effective was already passing. Russell was forming an identity that would allow him to carry the Long legacy without being crushed by it. When the United States entered World War II, Russell joined the U.S. Navy. He served as a naval officer, experiencing military discipline and leadership training that provided a different education than politics could offer. Military service also provided something else: distance from Louisiana, from family expectations, from the constant presence of his father's legacy. In the Navy, Russell was judged on his own performance, not on his family name. The war years gave Russell time to develop skills that would serve him in the Senate: patience, strategic thinking, the ability to work within hierarchical systems. He learned how to lead without dominating, how to achieve objectives without spectacle. After the war, Russell faced a choice that his siblings did not: whether to enter politics himself. Dolly had already chosen privacy. Palmer, the youngest, was not yet old enough to make the decision. Russell chose politics. This was not inevitable. He could have practiced law privately, built wealth, lived comfortably on the Long name without entering public office. But he chose to run for the U.S. Senate in 1948 at age 29. The decision represented both continuity and risk. He was betting that the Long name still had value in Louisiana, but also that he could be more than just his father's son. Russell Long's 1948 Senate campaign was carefully calibrated. He invoked his father's legacy, but did not try to recreate it. He ran as a Long, but he promised a different style: less confrontational, more institutional, more focused on concrete legislative achievement. Louisiana voters responded. Russell won convincingly, becoming one of the youngest senators in U.S. history. He would hold the seat for 38 years. The election validated his strategy. The Long name was still powerful in Louisiana, but it needed to be deployed carefully, not recklessly. Russell's first years in the Senate were marked by deliberate restraint. He did not arrive making grand speeches or challenging the establishment. He studied the institution, learned its rules, and built relationships. This approach was the opposite of his father's. Huey Long had entered the Senate as a disruptor, immediately attacking the leadership and positioning himself as an outsider. Russell entered as someone who wanted to master the system from within. He joined committees, learned parliamentary procedure, and developed expertise in areas that would give him long-term influence, particularly taxation and finance. Over time, Russell Long became one of the most powerful figures in the Senate. He served as chairman of the Senate Finance Committee for 15 years, from 1965 to 1981. This position gave him extraordinary influence over tax policy, Social Security, Medicare, and virtually every aspect of the federal budget. Russell's power was quiet, technical, and institutional. He shaped legislation through committee work, not through populist speeches. He built coalitions through negotiation, not through confrontation. He accumulated influence through patience and expertise. This was power of a completely different character than his father had wielded. Huey Long's power came from his ability to mobilize masses. Russell's power came from his mastery of legislative mechanics. The contrast between father and son was stark. Huey Long was a public performer, someone who built power through radio addresses and stadium rallies. Russell was a legislative craftsman, someone who built power through committee hearings and private negotiation. Huey Long challenged institutions. Russell mastered them. Huey Long was a revolutionary populist. Russell was a pragmatic institutionalist, yet both were effective. Both achieved significant power. They simply operated in different modes, suited to different historical moments. Russell married Catherine May Haddock in 1941. They had 2 children, but Russell kept his family life notably private. Unlike his father, who had involved his children in politics from an early age, Russell maintained clear boundaries between his public and private roles. His children did not become political figures. They did not carry the dynasty forward. Russell, having lived through the costs of political childhood, apparently chose not to reproduce that experience. Russell Long served in the Senate until 1987, when he chose not to seek re-election. He was 68 years old and had served for 38 years, one of the longest tenures in Senate history. His departure marked the end of the Long family's dominance in Louisiana politics. No other Long would hold major office. The dynasty that Huey had built and Russell had transformed was coming to a close. Russell's final years in the Senate were marked by respect from colleagues across the political spectrum. He had built a reputation for fairness, expertise, and effectiveness, qualities that transcended partisan division. Russell Long died on May 9, 2003 in Washington, D.C. at the age of 84. His death generated extensive coverage, with obituaries focusing on his legislative achievements rather than his father's shadow. This was his ultimate success. He had built a career significant enough to be evaluated on its own terms. He was remembered as a powerful senator, not merely as Huey Long's son. Russell's legacy demonstrated that a political dynasty could be transformed rather than simply continued. He had taken the Long name and given it new meaning, less dramatic perhaps, but more durable. Palmer Reed Long was born on January 5, 1921, in Shreveport, Louisiana. He was named Palmer Reed after a political associate of his father's. Even the youngest Long child received a name with political significance. Palmer was born into a family already fully embedded in Louisiana's political machinery. His father was preparing for the governorship. The household was organized around campaign strategy and legislative planning. Politics was not something that happened occasionally. It was the constant background of family life. Palmer's early years were spent watching his father consolidate power. By the time Palmer was old enough to form coherent memories, Huey Long was governor of Louisiana, commanding the state's political apparatus with unprecedented control. Palmer was too young to be involved in politics directly, but he was not shielded from it. He attended events, heard strategy sessions, and grew up understanding that his family was different from others, more watched, more scrutinized, more powerful. Unlike his older siblings, Palmer had no memory of life before his father's political dominance. This was simply how the world was. When Huey Long was assassinated in September 1935, Palmer was 14 years old, younger than his siblings, but old enough to comprehend the magnitude of the loss. For Palmer, the assassination meant losing his father at a crucial developmental moment. He was entering adolescence without the paternal guidance that would have shaped his understanding of identity, career, and purpose. The family's sudden loss of political centrality also meant that Palmer's teenage years were dramatically different from what they would have been. Instead of growing up as the son of a sitting senator and potential presidential candidate, he grew up as the son of a martyred political figure, a very different kind of pressure. After 1935, Palmer watched his mother serve briefly in the Senate, then watched his brother Russell prepare for his own political career. Politics remained the family business, but Palmer was not being groomed for it in the way Russell had been. The difference in treatment was likely intentional. The family had learned the costs of political life. Palmer, the youngest, was given space to develop independently. He attended school, pursued his education, but he did not show the intense political interest that Russell had demonstrated. Palmer's trajectory was already diverging. Palmer attended Louisiana State University like his brother before him, but unlike Russell, Palmer did not study law. He pursued business education, a clear signal that he was not planning a political career. After completing his education, Palmer made a definitive choice. He would not seek public office. He would not campaign for anything. He would build a career entirely outside the political realm. This decision represented the third possible response to the Long legacy. Dolly had withdrawn through geographic distance and privacy. Russell had transformed the legacy into institutional power. Palmer would engage with Louisiana society but refuse political office entirely. Palmer Long entered the oil and business sector in Louisiana, basing himself in Shreveport. He built a career in an industry that was central to Louisiana's economy but did not require political office. The oil business in mid-20th century Louisiana was lucrative and influential. Palmer could maintain social status, economic success, and professional respect without ever running for anything. He was a Long, and people knew it. But he was a Long who had chosen commerce over politics, private enterprise over public service. Palmer married and had children, creating a family life that was deliberately separated from political scrutiny. He maintained privacy in a way that would have been impossible for his father and difficult even for his brother. His children were not raised in political households. They were not expected to continue the dynasty. The Long name remained, but its meaning had changed. It was now simply a family name, not a political brand. In 1948, Palmer and his wife experienced the death of an infant child. The loss was profound and personal, noted in family records but kept private. This tragedy was theirs to bear privately, not publicly. Unlike his father, whose every personal experience became political fodder, Palmer could grieve without public performance. The ability to experience personal loss privately was itself a kind of freedom his father had never known. For decades, Palmer Long lived and worked in Louisiana without seeking office, without making speeches, without building coalitions. He attended business meetings, not political rallies. He negotiated contracts, not legislation. This did not mean he was uninvolved in Louisiana society. The Long name still carried weight. Palmer moved in influential circles, but his influence was economic and social, not political. He represented a path that was available to him specifically because of his family's history. He could afford not to seek power because power had already been achieved and then consciously relinquished. Palmer outlived both of his siblings. Dolly died in 2006, and Russell had died in 2003. Palmer became the last surviving child of Huey Long. In this role, Palmer served as a living connection to a historical era that was rapidly receding from memory. He could remember his father as a person, not just as a historical figure. He could remember the household dynamics, the political machinery, the transformation of Louisiana in the 1930s. Journalists and historians occasionally sought him out, looking for first-hand accounts of Huey Long. Palmer's recollections provided a personal dimension to a story that had become mythologized. Palmer Reed Long died on September 1, 2010, at the age of 89. His death was noted in Louisiana newspapers primarily because of his connection to Huey Long. He was identified as the last surviving child of the Kingfish. The obituaries were brief. Unlike Russell's death, which generated extensive coverage of legislative achievements, Palmer's death was notable mainly for what it represented symbolically: the end of living memory, the final closure of a historical chapter. Palmer's legacy is the legacy of conscious non-participation. He proved that it was possible to be a Long and not seek power. He demonstrated that the family name could be carried without being leveraged. In a sense, Palmer's choice was the most radical of the three siblings. Dolly withdrew through geographic and social distance. Russell transformed the legacy into a different kind of power. Palmer stayed in Louisiana, remained engaged in society, but refused to convert the Long name into political capital. This restraint, in a state where the Long name could still open doors, represented a form of discipline that was its own kind of strength. 3 children, 1 father, 3 completely different outcomes. Dolly withdrew, building a private life in Colorado far from the spotlight that had defined her childhood. Russell transformed the legacy, becoming one of the most powerful senators in American history through institutional mastery rather than populist spectacle. Palmer stayed but refused power, building a business career in Louisiana while consciously choosing not to enter politics. What unified them was not their choices but their shared origin. Growing up in a household where power was absolute, scrutiny was constant, and tragedy arrived suddenly, each found a different way to carry, reshape, or escape the Long name. Dolly chose privacy. Russell chose transformation. Palmer chose refusal. None of them simply continued what their father had built. That kind of continuity was impossible. The world that had made Huey Long's style of politics effective had changed. The New Deal had absorbed many populist demands. The machinery of modern politics had evolved. But more fundamentally, each child understood something their father had not lived long enough to learn, that power has costs, that legacy is not the same as identity, and that the ability to choose your own path is itself a form of freedom. When Palmer Long died in 2010, 75 years after his father's assassination, it marked the end of living memory. No one remained who could remember Huey Long as a father rather than as a historical figure. No one remained who had experienced the Long political machine from inside the family. The dynasty was over. What remained was history. And in that history, the children's choices are as revealing as their father's ambitions. They show us that legacy is not destiny, that inheritance can be refused, and that sometimes the most significant act is choosing not to seize power when it's within reach. The children of Huey Long did not need to become their father to matter. They needed only to decide, each in their own way, what the Long name would mean for them. And they did.